In 2004, on a morning that seemed perfectly ordinary in Tupelo, a gaunt man walked into the police station, no ID, no name, and no idea that he had been the lost soul on thousands of dust-covered missing posters for the past 19 years. Just weeks later, the truth hit America's heart like a knife. He was 12-year-old Gabriel Barnes, the little boy snatched from a rainy street by a brown Bronco in 1985, and then vanished without a trace. Today, I'm taking you straight into the eye of a tragedy that lasted almost 2 decades. What really happened in the moment? Gabriel slipped from his sister's sight, who dragged him into the darkness of a rotting cabin in Alabama, and how by some miracle, he survived to walk back into the light, after nearly 20 years swallowed by the world. This isn't just a missing person case. It's one of the most tenacious, agonizing, and fiercely hopeful survival stories the true crime genre has ever recorded. You are my absolute favorite people. Take a deep breath, because right now we're stepping into a journey that will leave anyone breathless and in tears. Before we dive into this real-life shocker, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you love cold cases brought back to life, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next part. In 1985, Meridian, a quiet little town in the heart of Mississippi, moved to the slow, trusting rhythm of the American South. Kids walked home from school barefoot on tree-lined streets, neighbors had known each other for generations, and fear was something rarely spoken of. In that seemingly unchanging life, the Barnes family, Frank, a mechanic at the local garage, Linda, an evening shift nurse at the county hospital, and their 2 kids, 12-year-old Gabriel and 9-year-old Emily, kept a steady routine in their small house on the edge of town. Every day Gabriel and Emily took the same short route home from Northeast Middle School, a walk so familiar they knew every telephone pole, every cracked sidewalk slab, and every spot where kids usually ditched their bikes. Gabriel was a quiet boy who loved observing everything and always carried a notebook to sketch maps of the places he went. Emily was lively and quick, under strict orders from Mom to keep an eye on her big brother after school. But on that early October afternoon, the sky over Meridian turned the color of lead wind, whipped dead leaves into spirals on the sidewalk, and the air grew heavy in a way both kids felt but couldn't name. As the flood of students poured out the school gates, a brown Ford Bronco appeared at the edge of the campus, parked motionless under the trees. Next to the driver's door stood a strange man watching the children, his gaze moving slowly like he was picking a target. Emily caught a glimpse, and felt something was wrong, while Gabriel slowed his step as the man walked closer, motioning like he wanted directions. Right then thunder cracked from the west. Emily flinched, bent down to retie her backpack strap, and put her hand over her head, as huge raindrops started falling. In those few seconds her view was blocked. When she looked up again, Gabriel was no longer where he'd been standing. The Bronco rolled away from the intersection, and the empty space where her brother had just been felt unnaturally strange. Emily ran the familiar route home, convinced Gabriel had just turned down a side street, but every direction was empty. When she got home, the family still thought he might have stopped at the ball field or a friend's house like usual. Those small assumptions, piling up on a rainy afternoon, cost the Barnes family precious hours before they realized something was truly wrong was happening. Frank started running through the neighborhood, calling his son's name through sheets of rain. Linda frantically phoned every classmate's house. Emily tried to describe the strange man, but her memory was scrambled by panic. After almost 2 hours of fruitless searching, the peaceful atmosphere that once wrapped the neighborhood gave way to chaos and dread. With no other choice, Linda picked up the phone, palms sweating, and reported to the Meridian Police Department that their son was missing. When Linda Barnes's call reached the Meridian PD dispatch, the system automatically classified it as a missing child and triggered priority protocol, forcing the nearest patrol unit to respond to the Barnes home immediately. The early evening rain still hadn't let up. Streets were slick and wind lashed the trees, but none of that slowed the patrol cars racing through Meridian's quiet neighborhoods. Upon arriving at the Barnes residence, The first officers quickly assessed the urgency. A 12-year-old boy gone missing right after school, carrying no personal belongings, with zero history of running away. That was enough to rule out voluntary disappearance and classify it as a likely abduction. Emily was taken aside for an initial statement. Though still terrified, she clearly described the brown Ford Bronco parked near the school and the man who approached Gabriel. Officers wrote down every detail she could recall: approximate age, hair color, and the fact he was standing by the open driver's door while talking to her brother. 3 evidence teams were assigned on the spot, one to canvass the siblings' usual walking route, one to the school grounds for additional witnesses, and one focused on gathering any information about the Bronco. As the team spread out, the case officer began noting core details to build the initial scene: the exact spot Gabriel was last seen, the seconds Emily lost sight of him, and the moment the Bronco pulled away. Heavy rain reduced visibility and washed away potential evidence, yet police still searched with flashlights along curbs, grass strips, and any turnoff Gabriel might have taken. At the school, a few remaining staff and students were quickly interviewed. They confirmed seeing a brown vehicle parked under the trees, but no one got close enough for a license plate or positive ID. In the neighborhood, the search expanded in a fan pattern within a 1-mile radius of the disappearance site, knocking on every door to ask if anyone saw the Bronco pass or had private security cameras that might have caught it. Simultaneously, another team contacted gas stations, garages, and repair shops around town to ask about brown Broncos that stopped by that afternoon. Back at headquarters, the Vehicle Records Unit started filtering registered Broncos in Meridian and surrounding counties, aware the abductor could easily be using fake plates or an unregistered vehicle. Meanwhile, the scene team compiled data to reconstruct the final 15-minute timeline before Gabriel vanished. Bell-to-bell school dismissal, the flow of students, the seconds Emily ducked against the rain, and the exact moment she could no longer see her brother. Connecting these points, police estimated the approach window was extremely brief. The boy likely forced or lured into the vehicle in under 60 seconds, and the most logical escape route was turning out of the residential area before reaching the busy main intersection. Rebuilding the timeline revealed the crime happened too fast for bystanders to register anything unusual, and too late for the family to react once hours had already passed. Although no concrete suspect had emerged, Meridian PD's preliminary conclusion was clear. This appeared to be an opportunistic abduction by someone with a vehicle, the ability to watch from a distance, and knowledge of how to approach a child at the moment least likely to draw attention. From the initial information gathered that first night, Meridian police moved to fully reconstruct the exact route Gabriel and Emily took every day, treating it as the foundation for pinpointing blind spots and the window the abductor had to make his move. The route started at Northeast Middle School's front gate, followed the sidewalk under a row of trees, then turned into the residential streets, leading to the Barnes house, a familiar low-traffic path usually busy with people at dismissal time. But when investigators walked it carefully, they discovered observation gaps no one had ever noticed before. By combining Emily's statement with the sudden weather change and the movement of students, they marked 3 clear blind spots: a corner hidden by an old wooden fence near the ball field, a downhill stretch blocked by thick trees, and the exact intersection where the Bronco had parked right before Gabriel disappeared. Each blind spot shared the same traits: no one nearby when the rain started, no residential cameras, and distant witnesses unable to see details. After mapping the route, police calculated precisely how many seconds the abductor needed to reach Gabriel. Using the average walking speed of a 12-year-old, the distance Emily was ahead, and the seconds her vision was obstructed by rain, they determined the abductor had only 20-40 seconds to approach, speak briefly, overpower or lure the boy, and get him into the vehicle. This matched the earlier assessment that the entire crime took place in an extremely narrow, almost invisible window. Next, they analyzed possible escape routes for the Bronco. From its described parking spot, there were three main options: one onto the busy main road, one looping behind the neighborhood and connecting to a quiet rural spur, and one toward a small nearby commercial strip. By cross-referencing the time the Bronco was seen leaving with recorded traffic levels on that rainy afternoon, investigators concluded the highest probability route was the loop behind the houses onto the low-traffic rural spur. That path offered obvious advantages for the perpetrator: few homes, no storefronts, and almost no one outside in the downpour. When they overlaid the blind spots, speed estimates, and likely escape direction onto a map, police were able to shrink the search area dramatically. Instead of the entire town, they now had a workable movement triangle the abductor likely used in the first 5 minutes after taking Gabriel. The triangle covered the turn from the school gate, the hidden corner under the big trees, and the connector road heading west. To strengthen the theory, they also calculated whether the Bronco might have made additional stops while fleeing, but timing and weather conditions made additional witness encounters unlikely. The conclusion of this analytical phase was unmistakable: the abductor had perfectly exploited the sudden weather shift, chosen a low-visibility route, and struck at the exact blind spot. Although the suspect's identity remained unknown, Meridian PD had significantly narrowed the critical zone, laying the groundwork for the next investigative steps, tracing the Bronco's movements and searching for any remaining evidence inside that suspected triangle. From identifying blind spots and possible escape routes, the investigation team returned to thoroughly re-examine the area where Gabriel was last seen, focusing on any physical traces that might remain despite the heavy rain that had fallen early in the afternoon. A group of technicians noticed a fairly faint tire impression at the edge of the road leading to the turn, exactly where Emily had described the Bronco being parked. However, the depth and shape of the tire mark had been affected by rainwater, making it nearly impossible to accurately identify the vehicle model from the tread pattern. Still, they photographed it, took measurements, and noted that the tire size was consistent with a mid-size vehicle. This was not enough to prove the Bronco was the vehicle involved, but it also did not rule out that possibility. As the investigation team expanded their canvassing of local residents, various witness statements began to emerge, but most were contradictory or did not match the timeline of Gabriel's disappearance. A woman living near the ball field insisted she saw a boy running through the area just a few minutes after school let out, but her description of the clothing did not match what Gabriel was wearing that day, and the direction the boy was heading was also inconsistent with the route the two siblings usually took. Another witness near the intersection said he saw a brown vehicle speeding away from the area, but when the timing was cross-checked, this sighting occurred after the family had already begun searching for Gabriel themselves, not at the time he vanished. Some even claimed to have seen a young boy talking to a familiar person near the convenience store, but when police checked the surveillance footage from that location, it only showed a different group of students passing by. No sign of Gabriel or a strange man. During the screening process, investigators had to constantly cross-reference every statement against the timeline established earlier to eliminate worthless sightings. The inconsistency among the provided information made analysis far more complicated. Several witnesses claimed they saw a brown Bronco in the neighborhood, but when asked about the exact time, each gave a different one, raising the possibility that they were simply misremembering due to the presence of many similar vehicles on a rainy day. Investigators noted that Broncos were not uncommon in southern towns at that time, making it difficult to narrow down any suspect list. When assessing the reliability of each statement, police prioritized those from people closest to the scene with unobstructed views not blocked by trees or weather. Most accounts were discarded due to excessive distance, mismatched timing, or descriptions that did not align with the details Emily provided. However, even the seemingly more credible statements only indicated the presence of a similar vehicle and offered no concrete information suggesting Gabriel had been inside it or had contact with the strange man. The constant appearance of noisy data, prevented the investigation team from identifying any specific lead strong enough to pursue immediately. Although the brown Bronco remained the only point of interest with potential direct relevance to the disappearance, police had not yet found any physical evidence or witness capable of confirming a clear connection between the vehicle and Gabriel. At this stage, the case file consisted only of scattered data points, a blurred tire mark, inconsistent witness statements, and the complete disappearance of the victim within a time frame too short for anyone to react. Police were temporarily unable to shape a central investigative branch, forcing them to continue expanding the search perimeter without any clear direction indicating the case was progressing in a specific way. The inability to establish a clear investigative direction forced the Meridian Police to expand the search to a community-wide scale, hoping to recover any remaining traces before the weather further destroyed the scene. Within just a few hours of the alert going out, dozens of neighbors volunteered, quickly growing to more than 100 people from surrounding areas, spreading out along the route from the school to the Barnes home, and into the side paths leading toward the forest. Under the continuing heavy rain that afternoon, people split into small groups, bringing flashlights, raincoats, and plastic bags they had equipped themselves with, but most had no knowledge or clear guidance on how to approach an open crime scene. This led to numerous procedural errors that the police themselves could not control in time due to the overwhelming number of participants. Many people, in their desperate effort to search, picked up items they thought might be relevant: a piece of cloth, a shoelace, a wet scrap of paper, but failed to mark the original location, completely destroying any forensic value. Some trampled over soft ground, unaware that a footprint or drag mark could be distorted in a single careless second. Several teenagers who joined at their parents' urging accidentally ran across trails, destroying the structure of fallen leaves that the forensics team had planned to analyze to determine the kidnapper's direction of movement. Along the dirt roads leading toward the Bienville forest, the prolonged rain had turned the ground into thick mud, almost completely erasing any tire tracks or heavy vehicle impressions. Any remaining tread patterns from the previous afternoon had been blurred by rainwater to the point they were indistinguishable from vehicles that had since passed through. Mud collected in old tire ruts, mixed with runoff flowing into ditches, washing away any comparable structure entirely. The forensics team tried to collect fresh soil samples but found no intact traces sufficient for analysis. They did discover a few areas with small footprints that could belong to a child, but because many volunteers were moving back and forth wearing the same common athletic shoes worn in the town, distinguishing Gabriel's prints from those of the searchers was nearly impossible. The complexity increased dramatically when police decided to deploy tracking dogs. Although this is a critical step in the early hours of a child disappearance, the weather conditions and the activity of hundreds of civilians rendered nearly all efforts ineffective. The dogs could not isolate scents because the route had been contaminated by countless footprints, different body odors, and personal items dropped everywhere. Moreover, Gabriel's scent had already begun washing away in the rain from the moment he vanished, severely hindering traditional tracking methods. One dog led the search team deep into the woods, but within minutes, the scent trail became confused, forcing them to return to the starting point. On two other occasions, dogs pulled toward the opposite northern area, but again there were no signs Gabriel had passed through. The canine deployment was ultimately suspended to avoid further contaminating the scene. When compiling the day's search results, the command team realized the actual situation was worse than initially anticipated. The entire key area had been heavily compromised before any professional investigative methods could be fully implemented. Heavy rain had erased most natural traces like skid marks, footprints, or dropped items, while the well-meaning crowd of volunteers had unintentionally destroyed the chance to collect meaningful evidence. The end-of-day report only noted a few scattered objects with no forensic value, and a list of community statements lacking consistency. When assessing the extent of initial evidence loss, the Meridian Police had to admit that the critical first hours, the golden window in any child disappearance, had passed without recovering any trace strong enough to shape an investigative direction. Physical evidence that could have confirmed a link between Gabriel and the Bronco was virtually non-existent, and community information only added more noise, making analysis even more tangled. By consolidating all collected data, the investigation confirmed they were dealing with a disappearance that had almost no physical foothold, placing them in a position where they had to broaden the scope of analysis, without any specific basis on which to focus resources in one particular direction. From assessing the extent of evidence lost during the initial search phase, the investigation was forced to shift to the standard suspect narrowing process of that era, beginning with screening individuals known to the victim and those living in areas Gabriel frequently passed through. This was a mandatory approach in every child disappearance case, especially when the scene yielded no valuable physical evidence. First, police worked with households in the Barnes neighborhood, verifying each person's timetable, location and activities. During the afternoon, Gabriel vanished. Several neighbors reported they were indoors because of the rain, and saw nothing unusual. Only Harold Kinney, the man living 2 houses down from the Barnes family, was placed on a watch list because he could not clearly account for his whereabouts during the critical time window. His initial statement contained many gaps, prompting police to examine him more closely even though no specific link to the crime yet existed. Concurrently with checking neighbors, police continued screening truck drivers who regularly traveled the roads around the school at dismissal time. A few scattered witnesses had mentioned seeing large trucks passing during the downpour, so investigators attempted to cross-reference logs at truck stops on the edge of town. However, in the 1980s, records of drivers' movements were not kept as rigorously as they would be later, making it difficult to identify who was in the area during the exact window of Gabriel's disappearance. Still, police compiled a list of more than a dozen drivers who had stopped in Meridian that day, conducted quick interviews, and gradually eliminated those whose routes overlapped but did not match the timing of the incident. Within the standard investigative framework, police also had to consider the possibility of family involvement, even though the Barnes family showed no suspicious signs. This step often caused tension within families but could not be skipped, as statistics from that era showed a significant percentage of child disappearances involved relatives. After checking Frank's and Linda's work schedules, and Emily's location at the time Gabriel vanished, police concluded all 3 had solid alibis with neither opportunity nor motive. Only a distant relative who had visited the Barnes home a few months earlier was briefly considered, but verification showed he was in another state at the time of the crime. Although the alibis of a few individuals on the initial suspect list were not strong enough to fully rule them out, there was also no clear evidence suggesting they were connected to the abduction. Some had gaps in their statements, but those gaps did not align with the critical time frame of the incident, leaving police without sufficient grounds to designate them as official suspects. Because there was no physical evidence from the scene to bolster any investigative direction, the Meridian police gradually veered toward pursuing suspicions based on personality, behavior, or subjective impressions from witness statements. This led to many days wasted focusing on individuals who in reality had no connection to Gabriel's disappearance. Instead of narrowing the scope using concrete data, investigators were drawn into a screening process based on guesswork, a very common occurrence in evidence-scarce cases during the 1980s. The crucial early days that should have been decisive passed without uncovering any valuable leads, making the case increasingly difficult to steer as every attempt to narrow the suspect pool ended in vagueness, with no foundation on which to build further progress. The initial narrowing of suspects yielded no concrete progress, causing the investigation to stall. Just 2 weeks after Gabriel vanished, the Meridian Police Department was forced to scale back resources allocated to the case and redirect them to other town priorities, which were also piling up during the prolonged stormy weather. Temporary patrol units were reduced, the house-to-house canvassing team shrank its scope, and the technical units maintained only a skeleton crew to process any new data that might come in. This left the Barnes family acutely aware that the official investigation was running out of steam, pushing them to expand their own independent search efforts, even though they knew the odds of finding fresh traces after 2 weeks were extremely slim. On his days off, Frank drove the back roads around town looking for any sign of a brown Bronco, sometimes venturing outside Meridian to nearby areas just to ask gas station attendants or passers-by if they had seen a suspicious vehicle. Linda, working night shifts while trying to stay in touch with local volunteer search groups, kept putting up Gabriel's posters at bus stops, grocery stores, and churches. Emily, though still very young, lived under constant stress as she was repeatedly questioned about the strange man she had seen, making her already vague memory even more fragmented and unreliable. Gabriel's disappearance also brought major changes to daily life in the town. Many families who used to let their kids walk home alone from school began organizing group pickups and drop-offs so no child was ever by themselves. Local stores started closing earlier on bad weather days, and residents grew warier of unfamiliar vehicles in the area. At church services and community gatherings, the missing boy case became the main topic, mixing fear with speculation and replacing Meridian's usual calm atmosphere with a lingering sense of unease. At the same time, local media began paying closer attention once they noticed how widespread the anxiety had become. Some newspapers ran stories that emphasized the danger, raising questions about the police department's investigative capabilities and the safety of children in the town. Local TV news crews came to interview the Barnes family, unintentionally adding pressure by rehashing sensitive moments from the day Gabriel disappeared, or highlighting mistakes made during the early search phase. Once the story went public, a few residents came forward with additional statements, but most were just guesses or hazy recollections colored by time and collective panic. As the volume of noisy, low-quality tips increased rather than decreased, the police found it even harder to keep the investigation moving at a steady pace. Eventually, the Meridian Police Department had to decide to temporarily halt any expansion of the investigation due to lack of evidence and lack of new leads. They did not close the case, but shifted it to a passive waiting mode, common in disappearances without clear witnesses. Gabriel Barnes's file was now maintained only at a monitoring level. Calls from the public were logged, but almost none justified sending officers back into the field. The Barnes family, though unwilling to accept this slowdown, had no choice but to face the reality that the official investigation could no longer deliver visible progress. In that atmosphere, the town of Meridian settled into a state of limbo. Nobody knew who the abductor was, nobody knew where Gabriel was, and every effort felt like spinning in circles with no way out. The investigation slowed, the family wore itself out, the community grew uneasy. Everything combined into a bleak picture that showed the first clear signs of a case sliding toward deadlock. The prolonged stall in the investigation, combined with the complete absence of any worthwhile leads for years, caused Gabriel Barnes's disappearance to slip down the Meridian Police Department's priority list. By 1990, the case was officially reclassified as a cold case under Mississippi state procedure. This meant it would no longer be actively investigated unless new evidence surfaced or a breakthrough connection emerged with another case. When the file was transferred to storage in Jackson, the few physical items collected in the first days after the disappearance, already sparse and inconclusive, began to degrade over time. Soil samples taken from the scene dried out and crumbled, destroying any microscopic traces like fibers or skin cells that might have been present. Paper records and documents yellowed, curled at the edges, and lost text where ink had faded. Even the photographs of the faint tire tracks, the only real basis for suspecting a Bronco, started fading because storage conditions did not control temperature and humidity properly. The situation was made worse by the lack of forensic evidence handling standards in the 1980s, before strict preservation rules were widely adopted. Items that should have been sealed separately were stored together in one large box, severely limiting future analysis possibilities. Some evidence bags were date-stamped incorrectly, some soil samples had no record of exact collection location, One important document simply said strange object found near the road with no further description, making it impossible to know whether it was actually related to the case, or just trash picked up during the chaotic early searches. On top of that, the physical transfer of the file from Meridian to Jackson introduced multiple small but significant errors. Some early witness statements got mixed in with paperwork from unrelated cases, and were only discovered years later when someone cross-checked witness lists. Hand-drawn maps of search routes were stored improperly, causing ink to smear so that notes became illegible. All these mistakes combined to make accurate reconstruction of the case in the future highly unlikely. The human factor added another layer of disruption. The lead detective from 1985, the one person who knew every small detail of the file, left the force in the late 1980s. He took with him memories and personal notes that had never been fully entered into the official record. This created a major information gap for anyone who might pick up the case later, because no document fully captured the original reasoning, eliminations, and investigative directions. When the file became a cold case, Gabriel's disappearance was not forgotten, but it remained in prolonged limbo, no new investigative direction, no physical evidence strong enough to re-examine, no additional witnesses, and no matches with other child abductions in the region. Each year the file was pulled for routine review, but nothing ever changed. In that environment, the case sat like an unfillable void in the Jackson storage facility, waiting for a new lead that no one knew if or when it would ever come. While the official file fell into stagnation and was pushed into storage, anything related to the victim's own experience, if the victim was still alive, was never recorded or analyzed during the initial investigation. Only many years later, when scattered data was re-examined, did Gabriel's perspective become a critical factor in piecing together overlooked information. Although a kidnapped child's memories are typically affected by time, psychological trauma, and prolonged isolation, certain details can still hold forensic value if properly categorized. Among those fragmented memories, the most vivid was the image of a wooden cabin deep in the woods, located in an area Gabriel later vaguely recalled as being in Alabama, not Mississippi, where he disappeared. The cabin had a low ceiling, dark wooden walls, and light that came in only through a narrow window high up. The constant smell of moldy, rotting wood and damp earth was strong enough to remain etched in his mind, along with the feeling of a small, isolated, silent space where every footstep on the wooden floor echoed loudly. Notably, Gabriel remembered the sound of a vehicle engine stopping near the cabin at night, a deep rumbling sound, not the sound of a new engine, suggesting the vehicle used to transport him may have been old or worn. He also recalled the heavy smell of cigarette smoke, apparently from his captor, and the loud whistling of wind through gaps in the walls on stormy days. Although these smells and sounds could not serve as direct evidence, they helped narrow down the type of structure, materials, and environmental conditions typical of forested areas in eastern Alabama at that time. Gabriel also described fragments of the journeys he was taken on, first a narrow, pothole-filled dirt road flanked by thick forest, then a long stretch of driving without stops, with the distant sound of heavy trucks, suggesting the cabin was near a route used by commercial vehicles. He remembered the vehicle once stopping where there was very bright yellow lighting, possibly a gas station, but the memory was not clear enough to identify signs or exact location. When later investigators categorized the memories by reliability, they focused on stable elements such as engine noise, cabin materials, environmental smells, and road characteristics, because those are harder to distort completely over time. Visual details like interior colors, or the exact shape of the cabin, were classified as unstable, since young children are easily influenced by surroundings, lighting conditions, or shifting mental states during captivity. Using methods commonly applied to long-term abduction cases, details like smell of rotting wood, feeling of a low-ceiling cabin, and pothole-filled dirt access road were treated as distinctive environmental markers that could be cross-referenced with forested regions of Alabama, where many cabins were built from old pine. Exposed to high humidity, and poorly maintained. The fragmented travel descriptions could also be matched against traffic maps from that era. If a cabin was deep in the woods, yet truck noise could still be heard, the distance to a major road could not be too great. These details could later be combined with geographic data to narrow the potential search area instead of combing tens of square miles. For forensic purposes, every memory related to environment, sound and sensation was separated into independent descriptive categories to create a memory data set, a collection of fragments that could be checked against real-world conditions if the cabin ever existed. The set included estimated cabin height, wall material, amount of natural light, wood humidity level, wind noise, type of dirt access road, relative distance to a major highway, and signs of the captor's habits such as cigarette smell or footsteps on the wooden floor. Although at that stage, no one had verified whether the cabin actually existed, the consistency of the memory cluster showed that Gabriel had spent considerable time in a place with distinctive characteristics, a location that, if ever pinpointed, could become the key to understanding what happened in the first days after he vanished. When the Mississippi State Crime Lab sent its response back to the Tupelo Police Department, weeks of record-crossing effort boiled down to a single conclusion: the DNA from the unnamed man matched 100% with the archived profile of Gabriel Barnes, the 12-year-old boy who vanished from Meridian almost 2 decades earlier. That result didn't just confirm identity, it became the biggest break in the case since 1985 and immediately forced the Mississippi justice system to reactivate a cold case file that had been gathering dust for nearly 19 years. The DNA match notice went straight to Jackson, where Gabriel's file was still shelved under no leads. Within 1 day, the file was pulled, moved to the Special Investigations Room, and reopened for full review. Yellowed, faded pages were turned one by one. Old photographs, now barely visible, were placed side by side with recent pictures of Gabriel, and every scrap of evidence collected in 1985 suddenly carried completely new weight because it belonged to a victim who had survived. The DNA hit drew the attention of the FBI office in Jackson, which tracks long-term missing person cases across state lines. Since Gabriel had been taken out of Mississippi in 1985 and resurfaced in another jurisdiction in 2004, the case officially became an interstate kidnapping, the exact trigger for federal involvement. A task force specializing in long-term missing victims was activated and began working directly with Tupelo and Meridian police. The FBI quickly pulled the original 1985 files to reconstruct the entire timeline while ordering a complete re-examination of every piece of stored evidence, no matter how degraded. Boxes once considered legally worthless were brought into the lab. Soil samples, fabric scraps, and faded crime scene photos were separated and processed again. Sketchy witness statements, torn handwritten notes, and vague descriptions of a strange man with a brown Bronco were reviewed line by line. The goal wasn't only to compare them with Gabriel's new account, but also to determine which pieces could now be salvaged with modern technology that simply didn't exist in 1985. While the FBI started pulling records from neighboring states to map the journey Gabriel might have taken, Mississippi investigators made a key observation: the case fit the rare pattern known as long-term abduction, a model documented sporadically in federal crime files in which the victim is removed from the area on the day of disappearance and kept isolated for years. What made Gabriel's case stand out was that the victim was still alive after nearly 2 decades, whereas most similar cases on record ended with the victim never found or discovered deceased. Classifying this as a rare successful long-term abduction not only refocused the entire investigation, but also created intense pressure for federal and state agencies to work closely together. Every overlooked detail, every seemingly unrelated note could now be the link that explained what happened from 1985 until the moment Gabriel reappeared. When the federal task force finished its initial review, it concluded that Gabriel's survival didn't just revive the file, it opened the door to decoding an entire chain of criminal behavior and placed the case in a much broader investigative context than a single small town like Meridian could ever provide. From a file once considered hopeless, the Gabriel Barnes case suddenly changed its nature. It was no longer an unsolved story, but one of the rare instances in which the victim came back, and with him came the key to finally understanding what happened the day the boy climbed into a brown Bronco and vanished from Mississippi almost 19 years earlier. Reactivating the file and bringing the FBI on board opened the door to applying modern forensic techniques to evidence that had been considered worthless since 1985, and that became the immediate next step after Gabriel's DNA was confirmed. The old evidence boxes, previously kept only for archival purposes, were transferred to the state lab for testing with new DNA and microbiological methods that could analyze material at levels impossible in the 1980s. Technicians began separating every sample under strict protocol: soil, fibers, wood fragments, and microscopic traces stuck to objects once thought untestable. Some samples were too degraded, but many others, especially fibers and wood chips, still retained usable structure. When processed through the latest generation DNA systems, the lab discovered a foreign DNA sequence on two separate items, one from fabric collected near where the Bronco was last seen, and one from wood dust stuck to the hem of a small shirt seized at the Hale house. Comparison showed this DNA matched Gabriel's sample exactly. This was a major breakthrough because it was the first time old evidence from the Meridian scene was directly linked to items recovered from the Hale residence. It not only strengthened the theory that Hale was involved in the disappearance, but also opened the way for deeper analysis of the cabin Gabriel remembered being held in. From there, the FBI ordered a search of all properties, private land, or cabins owned or used by Hale in Alabama between 1985 and 1990. A land records check revealed Hale had rented or used an old cabin in the woods, about an hour's drive from Tuscaloosa, a location that matched the terrain Gabriel recalled: dense forest, narrow dirt roads, and relatively close to commercial trucking routes. When environmental conditions at the cabin site were compared with Gabriel's memory, the overlap was striking: low ceiling, rotting wood walls, limited light, wind whistling through cracks, and a characteristic damp smell. Investigators then reconstructed the timeline of Hale's movements on the day Gabriel vanished. Employment records showed Hale had clocked out at a time that coincided with the abduction and did not return for 3 days. Combined with feasible routes from Meridian to Alabama, police determined that on that rainy afternoon in 1985, Hale could have left town just minutes after putting Gabriel in the vehicle without being noticed. The new timeline showed he likely took back roads west, merged onto the highway during heavy rain, and crossed out of Mississippi before a wide search was launched. Everything lined up with the FBI's documented snatch and immediate flight pattern seen in rare abduction cases. When Gabriel's DNA trace found on cabin wood was compared with samples from the Hale house, the match was perfect. This allowed the rapid conclusion that the cabin had been Gabriel's initial place of captivity after the abduction. Analysis of the old scene, even though the cabin had deteriorated and been abandoned for years, still confirmed multiple DNA layers, the two primary ones belonging to Gabriel and Hale. Forensic experts noted that matching DNA on evidence from both Meridian and the Alabama cabin was the strongest proof yet in the case. Thanks to this, the timeline was rebuilt with high accuracy for the first time. Hale approached Gabriel in Meridian that afternoon in 1985, took him to Alabama the same day, and kept him at the cabin long enough for the boy's DNA to adhere to objects and wooden structures. The expert conclusion confirmed the cabin as the original crime scene of confinement and established Hale's role in the kidnapping. A conclusion investigators had never had enough data to reach in the previous nearly 20 years. After concluding the Alabama cabin was most likely Gabriel's initial place of captivity, the FBI and local law enforcement conducted a systematic on-site search, even though almost 2 decades had passed since the cabin was last used. The old wooden structure had a partially collapsed roof and rotting walls, so the survey team had to temporarily brace it to prevent total collapse during excavation. The surrounding area was marked off and gridded, and the entire ground surface was scanned with specialized equipment to locate traces buried under years of accumulated soil. Everyone involved knew time had erased most major evidence, but microscopic traces could still survive on interior surfaces less exposed to weather, especially in remaining wood crevices inside the cabin. Upon entering the cabin space, technicians noted large sections of blackened, rotted wall paneling and discovered scratches and multiple sediment layers on the dirt floor. In one dimly lit corner, a technician found a small piece of fabric wedged in a wood crack. The color was almost completely faded, but the shape and fiber structure matched children's cotton clothing common in the 1980s. At another spot, they recovered a very fine hair stuck in a wood groove, somewhat protected from the elements. Field testing showed the hair had no root, but it was sent to the lab for DNA analysis if any organic material remained. Additionally, when the top layer of the cabin floor was excavated, a darker soil patch appeared compared to the surrounding area, indicating the cabin had seen prolonged human activity, not just days or weeks. On the east wall, the team also found numerous small dents and surface wear consistent with heavy furniture or objects having been placed against the wall for an extended period. Every trace, no matter how tiny, was collected with sterile tools and sealed under modern forensic standards to avoid repeating the storage mistakes of the 1980s. When the trace samples were analyzed in the lab, experts used biodegradation models to estimate how long the material had been present. The dark soil from the cabin floor showed long-term compaction consistent with repeated foot traffic. The cotton fabric had degraded in a pattern consistent with nearly 20 years of age, while residue on wood fragments containing multiple organic layers proved the cabin was not abandoned immediately after 1985. A particularly critical result was the match of trace DNA on the wood with Gabriel's known profile, further reinforcing earlier findings from the Hale House analysis. In addition to looking for signs of Gabriel, the forensic team searched for evidence of Hale inside the cabin. Dead skin cells and keratin traces found on remaining objects were compared with Hale's DNA taken from personal items at his home. Results confirmed both individuals had been present in the cabin, an essential condition to prove it was not just a temporary stop, but a long-term place of confinement. From the trace evidence analyzed, technicians determined the cabin had been used continuously for at least the first several months after the abduction before activity gradually decreased, suggesting Hale later changed locations or methods of captivity. Collecting key evidence at the cabin not only confirmed it as a crime scene of confinement, but also allowed investigators to separate items directly tied to Gabriel, the fabric scrap, DNA on wood, signs of habitation, and structural details that matched the victim's memory. Each sample was individually cataloged, sequentially numbered, and described in detail with exact recovery location, a process that ensures future retesting will not be hindered by earlier storage errors. Thanks to the excavation of the cabin and the entire surrounding area, investigators for the first time possessed a legally solid collection of evidence, proving the cabin was the most important confinement site in the initial phase after the abduction, thereby strengthening the file and allowing a far more complete reconstruction of the journey Gabriel endured during his first years missing. As the evidence collected from the cabin was confirmed through forensic analysis, the investigation team's next step was to directly cross-reference the memories Gabriel provided with the actual layout of the crime scene. This process served not only to verify the reliability of his memories, but also played a critical role in reconstructing the 19-year journey that Gabriel could not fully describe due to many periods being blurred by time and the conditions of his captivity. When presented with a cabin diagram based on real-world survey data Gabriel immediately recognized the location of the small window up high, the only source of light he always described in his memories. He also accurately pointed out the corner of the cabin with the rough, rotted wooden wall where the technical team had previously discovered fabric fibers and wood fragments containing his DNA. These points created clear matches, confirming that the cabin the investigators found was indeed where Gabriel had been held during the initial period following his abduction. His memory of distant truck sounds also aligned with the FBI's geographic analysis. A major highway a few miles south of the cabin had steady commercial truck traffic dating back to the 1980s, and the low hilly terrain in the area allowed sounds to easily carry back to the cabin on quiet nights. When memories related to smells, particularly the strong tobacco odor and the damp wood scent, were compared with chemical traces recovered from the cabin, the results showed significant overlap between Gabriel's descriptions and the environment that once existed there. This further reinforced the accuracy of his sensory memories, which tend to be more durable than visual ones. After establishing the cabin as the first detention site, the investigation shifted to analyzing memory fragments related to the moves Gabriel could recall. Although his memories of leaving the cabin were unclear, he was still able to describe the sensation of the vehicle traveling over rough roads before turning onto a paved section, then continuing for a long time on a straight route with few curves. Comparing this description with 1980s-era Alabama, Mississippi maps, the FBI identified several routes that matched the pattern: dirt roads leading out to highways, from which travel to neighboring states was possible without passing through densely populated areas. Combined with feasible travel data for Hale based on his employment records and known residences, the investigators were able to construct several potential routes Hale may have used to move Gabriel away from the cabin in subsequent years. At the same time, Gabriel's description of the man who held him captive was compared with Hale's personnel files, Idaho photos, and medical records. One key match was a slight limp in the right leg, something Gabriel had mentioned but could not clearly describe from his childhood memories. Hale's medical records confirmed a knee injury from a 1970s workplace accident that caused a similar uneven gait. Additionally, his heavy smoking habit and the characteristic dark, messy hair noted in records matched Gabriel's descriptions. These small details strengthened the link between Gabriel and Hale, while helping complete the psychological profile of the suspect to aid in reconstructing the long-term captivity behavior. Starting from the 1985 origin point in Meridian, moving to the Alabama cabin, then following fragmented memories of other rooms, long nighttime journeys, and residences that changed with each phase, the investigators pieced together segments to create a more complete temporary timeline. Although not every gap was filled, having a time anchor at the cabin, validated by DNA, allowed investigators to determine clearly that Gabriel had not escaped his abductor in the early phase, and that the move out of Mississippi occurred on the very day he disappeared. The accuracy of the victim's memories was assessed based on the degree of overlap between descriptions and forensic data. Descriptions of the cabin space, sounds, and materials achieved very high reliability. Descriptions of travel routes were considered valuable for orientation but not absolute, while visual memories of later detention locations were classified as insufficiently stable for use as direct evidence. Overall, however, these comparisons enabled the investigation team to conclude that the majority of Gabriel's critical memories were accurate and consistent, allowing reconstruction of a significant portion of the early phase of his 19-year captivity, and laying the groundwork for further expanding the timeline with additional data from later periods. After completing the comparison of memories and forensic data, the investigation team moved to federal standard identity verification to ensure that identifying Gabriel Barnes relied not only on DNA, but was also reinforced by multiple layers of biological, medical, and behavioral cross-checking. The DNA sample had confirmed an absolute match, but to complete the process, the specialized team compared Gabriel's adult physical characteristics with the medical information still on file from 1985, a small scar on his left knee from a bicycle fall at age 8, a slight curve in his right pinky finger, and a faint birthmark behind his shoulder. Upon direct examination, all these features were present on the rescued man, though some had faded over time. The old medical records also noted a mild pine pollen allergy, a reaction confirmed when medical staff observed his response after he was brought to an area with faint pine pollen in the air. These specific but minor biological details added an additional layer of verification beyond the DNA test, strengthening multi-layered identification according to FBI standards for long-term missing persons. Once the entire verification process met requirements, the investigation team proceeded to the next step, notifying the Barnes family. The information was first relayed to the Meridian Police Department, after which federal representatives and victim support specialists were dispatched to the Barnes home for a face-to-face discussion. Given that nearly 19 years had passed, the investigators understood this shock could have a severe psychological impact on the family, especially Gabriel's parents, who had lived for a decade and a half with unresolved grief. The notification followed FBI guidelines, delivering the truth cautiously, while assessing the family's capacity to process the news. Upon hearing that the nameless man found in Tupelo was in fact Gabriel, the victim of the 1985 disappearance, the family's initial reaction was stunned near motionlessness. Linda, who had kept the shirt Gabriel wore on his last day, took a long time to accept what she was hearing as real. Frank, though trying to stay composed, could not hide his dazed expression after years lived between hope and despair. Emily, now an adult, was given special attention by the specialists because memories of the disappearance day had haunted her childhood. As the family gradually calmed, preparations for the reunion began. The FBI conducted psychological evaluations on both sides to ensure emotional safety for the victim and relatives. For Gabriel, meeting his family after nearly 2 decades of isolation could trigger acute stress reactions, so counselors would accompany him throughout the process. For the Barnes family, they were briefed on potential psychological changes in long-term captivity survivors, emotional distance, heightened vigilance, or difficulty recognizing once familiar loved ones. A neutral, private medically supervised location was chosen for the reunion to maximize safety. Before the meeting took place, investigators had to complete the final identification step, not to re-verify identity, but to ensure all legal and medical conditions were met for returning the victim to his family. The multi-layered identification file, including DNA, biological markers, medical history, childhood identification descriptions, and unique behavioral signs, was finalized and sealed as an independent case document. Once every condition was confirmed and both sides were ready, the reunion could proceed under tight agency oversight, marking a pivotal moment not only in the investigation file, but in the lives of everyone involved. After identity verification and psychological preparation were complete, the reunion between the Barnes family and Gabriel was held at a secure facility, operated jointly by the FBI and Victim Support Services. The location was chosen for its privacy, environmental control, and the immediate availability of medical professionals in case the victim experienced excessive stress reactions. As the Barnes family entered the room, the atmosphere grew heavy with nearly 2 decades of separation compressed into a few seconds of silence. Gabriel, though aware he would see his relatives again, still appeared hesitant, a common wariness in long-term captivity survivors, whose personal relationships had been forcibly severed. That hesitation, however, began to melt when he noticed familiar signs. Frank's stance, certain unchanging features on Linda's face, and the way Emily, now grown, placed her hand on her chest the same way she did when scared as a child. These simple visual cues helped Gabriel gradually reconnect with his childhood memories and confirm that the people before him were not strangers in his completely upended life. To reinforce recognition, the FBI continued cross-referencing childhood markers through direct visual methods. Frank demonstrated a few poses Gabriel often struck as a young boy, such as tilting his head when focusing or touching the hem of his shirt when nervous. Linda, guided by staff, described highly specific details, like the location of a chipped baby tooth at age 6, or a small mark on his scalp from forceps delivery, and all were checked on the spot by medical personnel. When these features matched, the family bond became undeniable, and helped ease the tension filling the room. A key part of this reunion was not only confirming identity, but also establishing a stable environment for Gabriel during the initial recovery phase. After 19 years of total control over daily routines, communication and social contact, any sudden change could trigger strong psychological reactions. Therefore, Gabriel was not taken home immediately, but was first moved to temporary housing within FBI Victim Services, a space designed to let victims rebuild a sense of safety without instantly facing the pressure of a once familiar but now alien environment. During this period, psychologists worked directly with Gabriel to assess emotional responses to seeing his family again, adaptation to change, and any underlying anxiety patterns. Light testing was conducted to identify complex stress disorders, while the family received guidance on non-triggering communication and avoiding unintentional pressure on the victim. Gabriel also began initial social recovery activities, including controlled conversations, exposure to open spaces, and relearning basic autonomous actions such as choosing clothes, organizing personal items, or deciding meal schedules, abilities often lost in long-term captives. Additionally, he received emotional stabilization therapy to help him recognize psychological triggers stemming from captivity memories and learn coping techniques. Regular family presence within scheduled time slots helped build a stable emotional support network, but visits were limited enough to prevent overload. Each meeting, though brief, helped Gabriel gradually dismantle the distance formed over 19 years of isolation. From the moment of reunion through the initial stabilization phase, Gabriel's life shifted from controlled existence to guided recovery, laying the foundation for rebuilding family ties and preparing for future steps toward societal reintegration. Immediately following the initial stabilization phase, a team of psychological experts was tasked with conducting a comprehensive assessment of Gabriel's condition to determine the extent of PTSD and related disorders he might be experiencing after nearly 2 decades of isolation and control. The initial evaluation revealed many typical signs seen in victims of long-term captivity: heightened startle response to sudden noises, hypervigilance around strangers, unstable sleep cycles, and a flinching reflex in situations that reminded him of the captivity environment. Gabriel also showed mild signs of identity disturbance, common in individuals deprived of autonomy for extended periods, making it difficult for him to make personal choices without anxiety or fear of making mistakes. Based on these assessments, the team developed a long-term therapy plan for Gabriel that included phased trauma processing therapy, safe exposure therapy to reduce triggered reactions, and sessions to rebuild life skills. The goal of the plan was not only to help Gabriel overcome the psychological aftermath, but also to support him in rebuilding a sense of control over his life, a factor that had been almost completely erased during captivity. To rebuild his social skills, the assigned specialist implemented gradual practice sessions, small group social exposure, learning to exchange information, handling daily interactions, and adapting to public spaces. Gabriel needed time to refamiliarize himself with things that seemed simple: choosing food from a menu, talking to strangers in a controlled setting, or participating in social situations with multiple people. Everything had to be guided carefully because the risk of information overload was very high. Alongside the recovery efforts, Gabriel was also invited by the investigative team to participate in completing the Hale file, though he was never pressured. Psychological specialists were always present to ensure that providing additional information did not cause new trauma. Thanks to memories that had become more stable after therapy, Gabriel was able to describe certain details more clearly that had previously been vague, such as Hale's daily routines, changes in the captivity environment, or identifying features of locations he had been taken to. These details, though small, helped the investigative team narrow gaps in the timeline and determine the duration of each phase under Hale's control. Additionally, forensic technicians collaborated by representing recovered physical evidence for Gabriel to assess familiarity, but only when he was ready. In some cases, seeing the evidence clarified Gabriel's memories further, allowing the authorities to add details that could not be obtained through technical methods alone. All information gathered from Gabriel was integrated into the reconstructed file, enabling the investigative team to gain a fuller understanding of Hale's behavior and the multi-year movement pattern. Through the simultaneous process of therapy and working with the investigative team, Gabriel not only gradually recovered psychologically, but also became a key data source for completing the file, ensuring that everything he had experienced was documented as accurately and completely as possible. During the process of finalizing the file, based on new information from Gabriel and forensic results, the investigative team began facing numerous unanswered questions, forcing them to consider expanded possibilities beyond what was already known about Hale. One of the biggest uncertainties was whether Hale had acted alone or had accomplices assisting in the abduction, transportation, and long-term captivity of the victim. Based on his behavior and personal profile, Hale had no prior criminal record, no history of violence, and lived a fairly isolated life, but that did not rule out the possibility that he had associated with individuals exhibiting similar behavior. Certain details Gabriel recalled, such as hearing a second voice on rare occasions during the early years, led the team to consider the possibility that the cabin had occasionally been visited by someone other than Hale, although there was no direct evidence to confirm this. Another critical question was why the cabin was never discovered in 1985, when search teams were deployed across the Meridian area and a much wider surrounding region. Geographic analysis showed that the cabin was deep in the woods and located in Alabama, outside the initial Mississippi search perimeter, while most access routes were obscured by dense trees, meaning reaching the cabin required prior knowledge of its location or a specific reason to look there. Additionally, at that time there was no federal coordination system like today, so police from the two states did not share data unless there was clear evidence of a crime. This left the cabin, only a few dozen miles away, completely outside the reach of the 1985 search. While reviewing documents and evidence from Hale's home, the investigative team began asking whether Gabriel was the only victim. Several children's items did not match any of Gabriel's descriptions, including a pair of shoes that were significantly smaller, a book containing handwriting different from Gabriel's, and a wool blanket with hairs that did not belong to the victim. These items were not sufficient to confirm the existence of another directly related victim, but they also did not belong to Hale, putting the team in the position of having to consider the possibility that a second person had once been held, or that Hale had obtained the items from elsewhere for unknown reasons. Searches for other missing person cases from the same period in Alabama and Mississippi yielded no specific matches, but because many 1980s cases lacked complete DNA records, the team could not entirely rule out the possibility that Hale's activities extended beyond what the file documented. Another issue related to items of unclear origin was that some organic samples collected from the cabin contained DNA from an unidentified third party. This DNA did not match Gabriel or Hale and was not found in any state criminal database. The possibility that it was environmental residue or old DNA contamination from before Hale used the cabin was considered but could not be concluded. This made the cabin a site with multiple layers of usage history, further complicating clear delineation of the different phases. At the end of the analysis phase, the investigative team had to summarize the unresolved elements: inability to determine whether Hale had accomplices, inability to clarify whether the cabin had ever been used to hold anyone other than Gabriel, inability to fully explain the third-party DNA, and inability to completely reconstruct Hale's movements over the 19 years due to inconsistent personal records. Those questions became an inseparable part of the file, emphasizing that although the case had been reopened and most of the truth reconstructed, some dark corners of the story remained that time, shortcomings in the original investigation, and evidence storage conditions would not allow to be fully deciphered. The mysteries that could not be fully resolved did not diminish the investigative value of the Gabriel Barnes file. On the contrary, the successful reconstruction of a 19-year missing person case became clear evidence of the pivotal role modern DNA technology plays in solving cold cases. When comparing 1985 to the time the file was reopened, the investigative team could easily see that without modern DNA analysis techniques, the trace evidence recovered from the cabin and Hale's home would have had virtually no forensic value. Strands of hair without roots, wood fragments containing degraded DNA, soil and fabric samples that had deteriorated, all were considered no longer usable in the 1980s, but became critical evidence once advanced. Testing methods allowed DNA to be extracted and matched at levels previously unimaginable. This was one of the classic cases demonstrating the difference between investigative technology of the two eras, helping the FBI and numerous federal agencies strengthen their argument for expanding funding for forensic laboratories nationwide. Alongside the value of DNA came an important lesson in evidence preservation. Gabriel's file succeeded not only because of new technology, but also because some evidence, despite improper storage, had survived long enough to be tested. Degradation, staining, ink bleeding, evidence bags labeled with incorrect dates, everything revealed that the early stage of the case lacked standardized procedures, causing many items to lose value over time. The cabin in Hale's home clearly exposed the consequences of improper storage. If certain organic samples had been completely destroyed, the file would forever lack the ability to prove the link between victim and perpetrator. The existence of evidence that escaped total destruction turned the case into an annual reference point at professional conferences, where forensic experts stressed that a single properly preserved item can reverse the fate of a file thought to be lost forever. A third lesson came from analyzing the initial mistakes in the case. Bad weather, spontaneous searches, uncontrolled community participation, and gaps in witness information recording all contributed to derailing the investigation in the crucial first weeks, the most important time to solve a child abduction. The lack of federal coordination in 1985 also kept the Alabama cabin off Mississippi authorities' radar. These errors were included in the FBI's final report, emphasizing that missing child cases require rapid response systems and federal mechanisms from the very first hour, improvements later achieved through new federal protocols and the creation of the AMBIR alert system. Although the Gabriel Barnes case predated AMBIR, it became part of training material for new investigators, especially in cold case and long-term captivity courses. The file clearly illustrated how to combine victim memory with forensics, how to analyze trace evidence after decades, and the importance of avoiding reliance on subjective assumptions in the early stages of an investigation. Timeline reconstruction models, noise filtering methods, and procedures for evaluating old evidence were all drawn from this case and incorporated into the FBI's professional training curriculum. On a broader scale, the case prompted a re-evaluation of federal investigative methods, particularly in interstate disappearances. Federal agencies placed greater focus on building unified missing children databases, improving evidence storage methods, and standardizing file transfers between states. A subsequent Department of Justice review listed the Gabriel case as a prime example of how a seemingly hopeless file could still be solved with sufficient modern investigative resources and full coordination. As a result, new policies were proposed, including stronger requirements for collecting DNA from missing children, standardizing evidence collection in suspected abductions, and encouraging federal involvement from the outset. All these factors made the Gabriel case not only a remarkable instance of survival after prolonged captivity, but also a cornerstone for significant improvements in the cold case system and investigative forces across the United States. The final analyses of investigative significance and systemic impact laid the groundwork for completing the master summary of the file, in which the entire 19-year progression of the Gabriel Barnes case was recorded as a tightly connected chain of events, beginning on that rainy afternoon in 1985, when Gabriel vanished from his familiar route. Through the years of captivity in the Alabama cabin, the sporadic movements without trace, and finally his reappearance in 2004, that opened the DNA breakthrough that broke the long deadlock. The master summary fully documented the major milestones: the moment of victim contact, the interstate transport, the prolonged captivity phase, the DNA matches from cabin and Hale home evidence, and the perpetrator's identity being established only after he had died a year before the case was reopened. All legal conclusions were based on forensic evidence and corroborated victim testimony, bringing the file to a rare status: a surviving victim, a deceased perpetrator who could not be prosecuted, and several key elements, such as the possibility of Hale having accomplices, the existence of evidence of undetermined origin, or gaps in the timeline, remaining permanently unclosed. For the Barnes family, the impact of the nearly two-decade ordeal went beyond the lost time with their son. It fundamentally changed how they viewed life after Gabriel returned. Linda had to confront guilt for believing she had failed to protect him, even though the circumstances were beyond any parent's control. Frank, exhausted after years of fruitless searching, now had to relearn how to be a father to an adult son who had grown up under extraordinary conditions. Emily, the only witness to the day of the disappearance, carried mixed emotions of joy and regret, because her childhood memories were forever tied to the moment she lost sight of her brother for just a few seconds. Gabriel's return reunited the family physically, but the psychological healing process was slow and required ongoing professional support. For the Meridian community, the case left a lasting resonance from initial panic to a deeper awareness of the importance of rapid response and federal coordination in child disappearances. Residents who had witnessed the spontaneous 1985 searches still regarded it as the moment that changed how they approached community safety. The case also had a strong impact on local law enforcement, emphasizing that small mistakes in evidence collection and preservation can alter an entire case trajectory, while reinforcing greater caution in subsequent investigations. From the perspective of investigative agencies, the Gabriel file became a classic example of how a seemingly hopeless case can still be resolved through persistence, advanced forensic technology, and federal cooperation. The final master report, archived in Mississippi's Cold Case Repository, recorded the special legal status: victim located alive after 19 years, primary suspect, Thomas Hale, deceased prior to prosecution. Certain evidence-related elements and possible third-party involvement remain unproven. The final note in the file was closed with the line, "Found alive, case resolved with UN-resolved elements," reflecting the reality that although the core of the case had been illuminated, some shadows could never be fully closed, and the aftermath of the case would continue to be cited as one of the rarest long-term survival instances in the history of extended missing person files in the United States. Looking back on Gabriel Barnes's 19-year journey from a rainy street in Meridian in 1985 to being confirmed through DNA testing in 2004, this story touches directly on life in today's United States, where children still walk to school, still get out at the usual time on familiar streets, and families still have to balance community trust with necessary vigilance. A brown Ford Bronco that appeared harmless in front of the school, a strange man who just asked for directions, a few minutes of family misunderstanding, thinking the child was at a friend's house, then seemingly small mistakes like letting the community flood the scene, picking things up, stepping on traces, all show that sometimes what kills the chance is complacency and lack of knowledge about how to respond. In today's American life, where 911 systems, Amber alerts, security cameras, and social media have developed, the lesson is not just be more careful, but know how to use those tools correctly. Parents need to teach children very specific rules. Never approach a strange car, even if they just ask for directions. Always walk in groups. Know exactly who is authorized to pick you up. Adults, if you see a suspicious vehicle circling near a school, take a photo of the license plate and report it immediately to the school or police instead of just thinking, "That's weird," and moving on. The story also underscores the importance of respecting the crime scene in America today. If you join a search for a missing person, the best thing you can sometimes do is not rush into every bush but follow police instructions so you don't destroy evidence, because a single hair or scrap of fabric like Gabriel's can be the key many years later. And finally, Gabriel's PTSD, hypervigilance, and difficulty reintegrating remind us that finding the victim is not the end but only the beginning of the healing process. In a society like the United States, where counseling services and victim support are available, the community's responsibility is not just sharing touching articles or videos, but also supporting long-term programs for survivors, so they are not only rescued, but truly given the chance to live a full life afterward. Thank you for following the journey full of loss yet containing extraordinary hope of Gabriel Barnes. If you want to continue accompanying stories that are brought to light after decades, please remember to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video, where we will continue exploring files that seem to have sunk into oblivion, but can still bring truth and justice.